Okay, we are now down to item number 8. Item number 8 is a citizen's petition, climate emergency resolution. So the next individual is Marco Alatorre, and he has 10 individuals he's listed on his card. So if those individuals could come forward with him.
Hi, my name is Marco Alatorre. I live about a mile from downtown here in Flagstaff, and I'm representing the Parents and Grandparents Coalition. What truly gives those of us with children nightmares is the prospect of things we can't control, and as many of you on council are also parents, I know that you can sympathize. Let me offer the example of a drunk driver. Like drunk drivers on the road, climate change is already a reality, and the impacts caused by each can be devastating, even fatal. Fortunately, awareness and interventions have resulted in a decrease in drunk driving fatalities over the past decade, but without immediate, drastic action to stop it, we will be hit by the climate crisis, and the impact could be unimaginably catastrophic. As parents and grandparents, we will seize every opportunity available to take action to protect our children against anything that's out of our control. While I can't control the drunk driver that hits my car, you better believe that my 10-month-old baby will be strapped into a car seat when that impact arrives. You all, our city council, have been put in the driver's seat here in Flagstaff. You are not only the parent who needs to install the car seat, but also the sober friend at the party that's responsible for not letting the drunk have their keys in the first place. In passing Flagstaff's Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, you already placed an order for a car seat, and we thank you for that. We are here to ask you to not only take the next step of installing the car seat implementation, but to also update your order so that we get the best freaking car seat available, so that when the impact comes, the results are minimized, because the climate emergency could get so much worse than almost anyone in the general public is aware. As a former high school science teacher, allow me to try and remedy that. This block represents the amount of greenhouse gas that humanity puts into the air every year. If we continue to disregard the climate crisis and stick with business as usual, the evidence suggests the warming we've caused will further thaw Earth's permafrost, releasing methane, a greenhouse gas that's about 30 times worse than carbon dioxide when it comes to warming. And by 2040, the amount of greenhouse gas that the Earth itself will emit could be as much or even more than we currently are. Let me repeat. In just 20 years, the Earth itself could be releasing as much greenhouse gas as we are now. The worst buy one, get one free deal ever. But wait, there's more. That amount of methane will warm things up a lot more, thawing a lot more permafrost, triggering a vicious cycle known as a feedback loop. And by the end of the century, the amount of carbon that permafrost could be releasing would look like this. 4 to 7 times humanity's current emissions. We can reduce our own emissions, but once a feedback loop passes its tipping point, it cannot be stopped. But some people might be thinking, wait, that block is the Earth's emissions at the end of the century? Aren't we getting a little ahead of ourselves here? No. My children will still be alive in 2100. The point of my sign here is to illustrate that our focus when we talk about climate change is dangerously short-sighted. My baby is less than a year old, so he'll only be 80 by the year 2100. And yet we talk about the effects that we might see from climate change by 2030 or 2050, or maybe the end of the century at best. But what about his children and grandchildren? We have to consider the effects that our decisions today will have for centuries to come. So let's take a look at what the science has to say about what those effects will be if we continue with business as usual. First of all, I left out the last statistic on permafrost. By the year 2300, the Earth could be emitting this much carbon. 11 to 17 times the current emissions of all of humanity. And permafrost is just one of many feedback loops that will be unstoppable if they pass their tipping points. You might think of it as the first drunk to leave the party, and we're about to let them have their keys. Another feedback loop is sea level rise. The latest research shows that melting from the Greenland ice sheet alone, much less Antarctica, could expose hundreds of millions of people to flooding within my children's lifetimes. Two more feedback loops are the collapse of the Amazon rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef, which are teetering near their own tipping points. And worse still, there are many more, and all of these tipping points are interconnected. If one goes, it's likely to trigger a domino effect where they all tip. Once the first drunk grabs his keys, the rest follow suit, and dozens of drunk drivers hit the road. Forest fires are another feedback loop with a terrifying tipping point. Forests are normally a carbon sink, removing carbon from the atmosphere, but the warming we've caused is leading to more and worse fires, as we've seen for ourselves in our own backyard. When a forest burns, it releases all of the carbon it's removed from the atmosphere over centuries. That carbon warms things up more, exacerbating forest fires, and on and on. Forests like ours are now approaching a tipping point where rather than a carbon sink, they could become a net source of carbon. As for Flagstaff specifically, we all recently experienced the real-time fear of our forest on fire and the ready, set, go evacuation protocol. And anyone who lives in Sunnyside or helped fill sandbags after the museum fire understands that the threats to the safety of our children and grandchildren continue long after the flames are out. Also, last February, we all had to dig out from under the biggest snowstorm on record, immediately followed by praying for rain to quench the fires during the driest monsoon season on record. And climate change doesn't just make weather patterns more volatile like that, it also changes entire climates, hence the name. Most places will become generally hotter and drier, more like places at lower elevations. In a century or two, Flagstaff's climate could be much more like that of Sedona, which you may have noticed is inhospitable to ponderosas. We could lose our entire forest. I fear my children living through worse and worse fires in the coming decades, more like those currently raging through Australia. I fear my kids and grandkids growing up in this world where experts are already predicting that the wars of the future will be fought over water. But being a parent is a duality. Fear is balanced by hope. I find hope in the fact that the general public is starting to wake up to this emergency. I find hope in people like Greta Thunberg and those of us that are out there with our signs on the lawn of this city hall every Friday, carrying on her Fridays for Future movement here locally as others are doing around the world. I find hope in the fact that there is still just barely enough time to walk ourselves back from the brink, and in the fact that we know exactly what needs to be done and by when. Flagstaff's own Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, or CAP, states on page 42, quote, "The October 2018 United Nations IPCC Special Report highlighted the need to contain global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. This plan, Flagstaff's CAP, does not incorporate the heightened urgency for action due to the timing of this report's release. The Flagstaff community must discuss this report and determine appropriate response," end quote. So we, the Flagstaff community, are here to discuss. And the appropriate response would be to adjust the goals of our plan to be in line with the guidance of that UN report, which was signed by over 11,000 scientists, and the bottom line of which states, quote, "An immense increase of scale and endeavors to conserve our biosphere is needed to avoid untold suffering due to the climate crisis." Flagstaff's plan currently calls for an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. But the UN report states that we need to at least keep the chances of triggering these tipping points to a coin flip by limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees, and to do that, worldwide emissions would need to be reduced 80% by 2030, not 2050. Even then, we'd be dependent on every other city doing their part. And again, that makes the chances of avoiding these tipping points just 50-50. That would be like ordering the bargain basement car seat for our children. We need to upgrade our order so that we're less dependent on others doing their part, and we give our kids a better than 50-50 shot. We need to order and install the most ambitious car seat possible. The goal of our plan should be 100% carbon neutrality by the end of the decade, giving us the best possible chance of not letting these feedback loops be triggered in the first place. And the best part of doing that is that implementing that would also be good for Flagstaff in every other way imaginable. Doing this globally would require a movement on the scale of the domestic war effort in the 1940s, but I find hope in history. Back then, once everyone understood that the extent of the emergency and what was at stake, the nation came together to execute that war effort, which created millions of meaningful jobs, pulled us out of the Great Depression, and slingshot us into decades of prosperity. Sign us up for that. Set the goal of carbon neutrality by 2030 and declare a climate emergency today. As the first city in Arizona to do so, we will be sending a strong message that Flagstaff is open for business, investment, and innovation. And this time, instead of building weapons of war, we can put that effort into creating a more equitable world powered by clean energy. That's the inheritance we want to leave for our children and grandchildren.
Council, I'm going to go ahead and turn the conversation inward. Mr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess the first question is there a climate crisis? The answer to that is obvious. Yes, there is. I was in a group that was called Pneumatic Control Systems. The biggest and most interesting issues was stability of these systems. So I learned something about control theory. And basically, this is a control theory problem. Some people talked about tipping points. I'm very concerned about tipping points and feedback. One or two speakers talked about how that there's these feedback loops where, like, if it gets a little warmer, then the permafrost defrosts, and then that starts emitting methane. And then things, remember the little cubes that the one speaker talked of? That really is meaningful to me. So I think of everything I heard tonight for 3 hours. These feedback loops are the thing that really scare me the most, because I think the thing could really get out of control. The temperature increase we got over the last 2 or 3 decades, and it'll be another of that same amount. No, it could be way more than that. So on a more positive note, what I feel here tonight is not a tipping point. I feel a turning point. The bottom line is, I don't even have to say it. Should we support a resolution? Absolutely, obviously. Thank you, Mayor.
You're welcome. Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor. I too would like to start off by thanking all of you. Again, we work for you, so you better believe that you being here is impacting us right now and moving forward. And so I urge that you continue to stay involved and stay active, because as anyone who's been in this chamber knows, it takes one person to influence us up here. And so that person could be you. Sarah, you spoke about proactive rather than being reactive. And the truth is, when we are proactive, it saves us a lot of money. Because when those disasters happen, those are extremely large costs that we as a city cannot afford. Tom talked about all sorts of things, from EV to net zero buildings to the county's efforts around sustainable developments and us building roads versus implementing better infrastructure for public transportation and bicycle commuting. Marco, I want to thank you for your advocacy and your organizing and your passion and your efforts, and for attending my town hall meeting last night and getting into a pretty good conversation with me about that last night. And I just want to say thank you. And then Councilmember Sauce, you said it's time. And it is time. It's actually past time. But it is time for us to do something. So let's do it. So I look forward to us declaring a climate emergency. I think we're all on the same page with the emergency. Thank you.
I want to say thank you to the individuals that are here, those of you who left, those of you who sent us emails, those of us who are watching from home. My kids will still be alive in 2100, right? Marco said that. I have been living a life of urgency since I came into this world. I'm going to go back to that one. Nikki said that. Equality was mentioned by Kelsey. So I want to add my voice to what's been said tonight, not only by the members of the public, but council here. When I grew up playing in the Rio de Flag that actually flowed. There was water in it. I grew up at a time where it snowed from the beginning of October through March. And I'm pretty proud to be third generation, but I want to be clear. There are people who've been here for 500 generations in this area, the majority of which were not here tonight. We talk about adapting. I just feel the need to say that there are people who have been adapting for generations because of the impact of their fellow human beings. And I would like for those people to be more involved in this conversation moving forward. I appreciate all the scientists that were here, but I think some of what we need to be adaptable, to get to the next norm, we need to reach back to the individuals who have been adapting and get their mother wit, for lack of a better word, and bring them into the conversation, because I think those are the individuals that we're going to need moving forward. I agree with the statements that were made that we need to do more than just declare an emergency, right? We can do that all day, every day. It is about following through with intent that is thoughtful, direct, and now I'm going to turn inward to the council because you all said bold. Several of you said bold. Okay? So let's talk about that. If we're going to move forward in a matter that's bold, that means this council is going to have to grow a backbone. There's no other way I can put that. You know, we talk about making places more walkable, yet every single time we have a high-density project, we have drama. And we said no. Each and every single time. So I'm going to tell council, let's be bold. And the next time we have the ability to do the right thing, we need to do it. Just in case anybody missed it, I want to say that was 7-0 in support of a climate emergency resolution.